diverse and thought-provoking, informative discussions every month. And while I'd like to take credit for what I know will be a fantastic presentation, my predecessor, Ginny Baxter, initially arranged for this program to take place earlier this year, but due to COVID-19, we had to reschedule. So I want to thank Ginny for her effort to put this together. And so you all know, it actually worked out because October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and so this topic is very timely. We're fortunate to have with us our very own resident expert in intimate partner violence and board member for WomenShelter Long Beach, Alyce LaViolette. Alyce started one of the first programs in the country for spouse abusers and specializes in anger management, domestic violence counseling for survivors and perpetrators, gender issues, couples counseling, and a broad base of individual issues, including serving as an expert witness. Alyce is also the author of It Could Happen to Anyone, Why Battered Women Stay. Please welcome Alyce LaViolette.
So I would like today, thank you, Erlinda. I'd like today to be as informal as it can be, so please feel free to jump in when you have questions or things you'd like to bring up. I'm going to start by telling you a COVID story because, as you might expect, domestic violence is also called a pandemic during COVID, that people who would normally have a way to get away from each other oftentimes are not. So I'm going to tell you, I've gotten probably 5 new clients who are battered women in my private practice. And I want to tell you about one of them because it sort of typifies what's going on now. For a lot of folks who are pretty smart and pretty high functioning, they have realized that physical violence is going to get them arrested and maybe even get them into court, because it's hard to get into court right now. So they're doing what's called psychological abuse, or the new term is coercive control. And this particular young woman called me. She's a doctor. She had lost her children. Her ex-husband, who, well, they're estranged right now, hit his head into a wall and left a mark. In California, that's called traumatic injury to a spouse if there's a mark. And arrest is mandatory in California. So she was arrested. She was nursing 2 children. Both of those kids were taken away from her and placed with the abuser. She had to express milk for 3 weeks until they discovered, because he continued to fail his alcohol and drug testing, that he was the one who was lying. She has her kids back now. But because they were granted mutual restraining orders, and because he would come to the door and she would feel bad and let him in because her little girl was crying, she was also charged with failure to protect. And the Department of Children and Family Services started to take the kids away from her again. I've just written a letter. We've gone to dependency court. She has her children, but she's being watched for failure to protect, even though she is a very supportive and protective mother. So I just wanted to tell you that, because part of what's happening now is that courts are not taking in any cases that are not seen as emergent and where there is egregious and general physical abuse. So the emotional abuse, the stalking, the internet kinds of things, the social media kinds of things are not being prosecuted the same way. And so part of what we're doing is creating, in her case, a series of Instagram posts, emails, etc., that are threatening, so that we can put them together and maybe get her into court. So I don't know if anybody has any questions about what's going on right now, but I'm happy to answer them if you do. But I wanted to make this a little more personal. I wanted us to think about what it would be like for us. So I'm going to ask you to flash back and think about your very first intimate relationship. Think about the first time that you fell in love. Flash back to the 6th grade if you have to, but think about the first time you fell in love, and think about your hopes and your dreams. Think about where you learned about what love meant. Think about your own family. Think about books and movies. Think about TV shows. Think about where you learned about love. And I have a couple little theories about relationships. One of them is that most of us could live with a serial killer for about a year, and if we were in love, we wouldn't notice. Because the serial killer would be on their best behavior, and the energy of love, new love, is bigger. It's the biggest drug high there is. So that part of what happens is that you don't see the symptoms of somebody's pathology until relationships begin to settle down. And that can take a year and a half. Could take a little longer than that if you're dealing with somebody who's really sharp about it. And I would just say that perpetrators of domestic violence are much more fear-based than they are rage-based. That rage is a cover-up for the fear. And so when we're working with them, we're working with fear a lot. My second little theory is that most of us make promises and commitments, and that those promises and commitments define who we are. And when we promise to stay with somebody for better or worse, when we think about qualities that make us good people, we often think of empathy and we think about empathy, we think about commitment, we think about these things, but that we often base our promises and commitments on ignorance. We don't actually know who we're promising what to. And that we don't have somebody that we love come up to us and say, hey, look, I'm an alcoholic, but I'm not like a bad one. I'm like, I'm a lot of fun. But here's the deal. If we're together, when I get a DUI, we're going to have to come up with bail money, and we're probably going to have to come up with attorney fees. And in addition to that, we're going to have to pay for DUI school, and that's kind of expensive. And if you love me, you're probably going to want to drive me wherever I need to go if they take my license away again. So I'm going to count on that. And here's the deal. If you get in my face about it, I'm probably going to slap you around a little bit because I'm not going to like that. How many of you would say, that works for me? I can do that. But most of us don't get that information. And I would love to see all the people. I see Francis, but I can't see anybody else's face, and it's fun to see other people's faces. So I don't know if that's possible. Anyway, but Francis, you're a great audience, so thank you for that. Okay, so think about those things in terms of relationship. And what I'm going to do is walk you through. I'm going to walk you through a relationship, and I'm going to ask you to become the victim in this relationship. And I'm going to ask you to think about what would be egregious enough for you to leave, or what would create a reason for you to stay. So I'm going to walk you through a true story. I actually saw it in 60 Minutes years ago. It was a battered woman who took a contract out on her husband. She hired a hit woman. We're trying to get women into some higher paying jobs, but she was a woman who started her relationship like most of us do. They got together, they started dating, they were enamored of each other, So they disappeared from sight. You know, they didn't see their friends or anybody too much. They were just all together. And then they resurfaced. And during the course of their, you know, dating relationship, there were some things that happened, like her husband or her boyfriend at the time would get angry sometimes and drive a little crazy in the car. And sometimes he would get jealous and wouldn't talk to her for a period of time. But she sort of wrote that off as, you know, these things happen. And they decided to get married. And they had the family together, the community, their friends, and they got their little 4-slice toasters and their little blenders and their towels with the monograms on it. And everybody was happy for them. And they'd been together a couple of years, and they had an argument and a fight that was different than the other arguments and fights that they had. And during this argument, during this fight, her partner picked up one of their wedding gifts and threw it against the wall and broke it. What do you think you would do if that happened? How do you think you would react to that? And if you want to shout out something, feel free. You can just unmute yourself.
Shock.
Shock. Okay. And Frances, how would the shock, do you think, play out for you?
I think shock that it happened, and then just horror, and then I'm in this still. Maybe this is just a one-time thing.
Yep. Okay. And maybe it is. And we don't know that yet, right?
Right.
Anybody else have a reaction to that?
I will, because in my first marriage, that same thing happened to me. And he was a lot bigger than I was, as you can imagine. And he actually got so mad driving once, he hit his fist on the dashboard of the car and it cracked.
Wow.
But you don't understand it at the time, because I had 4 brothers, but I had never seen that kind of anger ever. So I was really unprepared to deal with it.
You know, it's interesting, Carolyn, when you say that, because a lot of people try to find pathology in, generally speaking, because generally speaking, it's not that women can't batter men. It's that more frequently, much more frequently, probably 80 to 85% of the perpetration is male and female in heterosexual relationships. And there's this move to pathologize the female victims. Like, what's wrong with you that you stayed? Obviously, you have pathology. One of the things I've found is that women from healthy families have no preparation whatsoever
Right.
for somebody who is abusive. So it sort of doesn't matter. What I've seen that's different is that people who have chronic trauma, like maybe child abuse, maybe they've had sexual assault in high school, maybe they've had teen dating violence relationships, but the more frequent the trauma and the less resiliency of the victim, they're more likely to repeat. But it doesn't, when I wrote it can happen to anyone, it's because even when I worked at the shelter and then in private practice, I found that it doesn't matter how educated people are, or what socioeconomic group they're in, or what religious group they're in, although there are religious groups and some cultural, you know, implications that keep somebody there longer. So let's take this a little further. Let's talk a little further on this. So this couple did what most couples do. They make up. And there's a promise that I don't know why this happened. I don't know why I got so mad, but it's not going to happen again. I'm not going to do that again. And so they move on with their lives. And as they move on with their lives, they're both working. They buy a new car. They buy furniture. They go on vacation together. They take pictures. I still take pictures. I don't do Shutterfly yet too much, but you know, they have memorabilia from their vacations together. Sometimes they sit down, they have nice dinners together. And then there are these other times when her partner gets upset and at one point kicks over a coffee table. And at another point yells and calls her some names. She gets pregnant and the family's excited. Everybody's happy about this. Meanwhile, she hasn't talked to people about what's going on. And the reason for not talking to somebody is there's a number of reasons. One is that you don't know, if you haven't been in a lot of intimate relationships, what's normal in an intimate relationship. Secondly, you want people to like your partner. Thirdly, you want people to hang out with. And the fourth thing is you don't want anybody to think you have bad taste. So all of those things are happening. She's pregnant. She quits her job or takes a leave right before the baby's born with the intention of going back after parental leave. The baby's a couple weeks old and they decide to have a religious ceremony celebrating the birth of the child. And everybody's in on that. Everybody's excited about that. The baby's about a month old or so, and they have an argument and fight that's different than the other arguments and fights that they've had. And during this argument and fight, her partner calls her names, kicks over the coffee table, and slaps her across the face. Now make this you. Make this your relationship. What do you think you're going to do at this point?
Fear and horror, and now you don't know what to do.
Okay, now you really don't know what to do.
Now you really don't know what to do.
There's a lot of pressure on Frances because Carolyn and Frances are the only two people I can see. So they're my audience, man. I hope you don't feel, well, I do hope you feel the pressure of responding. That would be great. Okay, so absolutely, fear and horror.
And this is Linda Silver.
Hi, Linda.
Hi, I would leave. At this point, I would be gone.
Okay.
Well, it sounds really easy to say that, but when you're in the middle of it,
I've been in this situation,
well,
and I did leave.
So Linda, let me ask you something. There's no way I can talk you out of it. There's nothing I can do to convince you that you should give me another chance.
No.
Okay.
None.
Okay, so what if I say to the rest of you, I am so sorry. I can't believe I did this. And I will do anything. I'll go to counseling, whatever it takes. Just give me another chance.
Not if you touch me.
Okay, so Linda's gone. Think about the rest of you.
I stayed. Unfortunately, I stayed too long. It was like,
too.
I was afraid of failing, and I had made a promise to myself, and I wasn't quite sure I could go to my family and friends and say I made a mistake. And I stayed. And
Well,
mine wasn't physical, mine was mental.
Yeah, I was never physically hit, but I stayed too. And I was a teacher at the time. I had a master's degree, so I could go out and make a living anyway. He was an electrical engineer, but it does something to you, especially, I guess, if you're somebody who has no option to financially be able to leave. And when I left, I had so many friends saying, gosh, you're so brave.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've been 10, 12, 20 years, I've been wanting to get out of this marriage and I just don't know how. I didn't feel that brave when I finally left, but it's more insidious.
It is.
Well,
I think two groups of women can leave with 3 boxes in their back seat. The very poor and the very rich. And those of us that are in the middle, we can't leave with 3 boxes in the back seat because we invested in his education. We invested in that house we're living in. We invested in creating the financial infrastructure that we're dependent on. And so 3 boxes in the back seat is not enough. and we know we can't turn around and fight for, like a rich person might be able to, you know, go back and fight for the trust fund. You know, we don't have that. Everything we have is what we made. And so when we walk out with 3 boxes, it's a much, much bigger break than someone who has nothing or someone who has everything.
Yeah, and I will tell you what was interesting to me is I've worked with some very rich people and very wealthy people, very well-known people, and part of what happens with them is the public scrutiny, plus their partners have the finances to hire private investigators and the best attorneys to, you know, bankrupt them basically in court, even when they have a lot of money. It's very interesting. And poor people feel like they don't have many resources in that. I mean, you have to get into a battered women's shelter, generally speaking, you're the people with the fewest resources to be able to get in. But there isn't bed space for nearly the numbers of people. So there's a lot going on. Now think about it. What do you feel besides being shocked and horrified? When you get hit, what do you feel?
What did I do wrong?
What's that? Does anybody get angry?
Yes, I do.
Sure. I want to hit him back.
So when in this culture are women praised for their anger?
Never.
There's one exception.
When they're protecting their children.
Absolutely. If you get angry in your own self-defense, what are you called?
Starts with a B.
That's bitch for 200, Alex.
Oh.
So what you've got is you're crossing, for women, you're crossing a cultural norm. And when you look at women who have apparent resources to get out, whether that's family, whether that's economics, whatever that is, one of the things that often holds us back is the culture we're raised in and the beliefs we have growing up as women. And I don't have as much time to go into that today because that's a whole other talk, but think about it for yourselves, what you grow up believing about your role in family and keeping family together. And if the family fails, who fails? So all of these things come into play. Now, the other things that come into play, what if you have a green card that's dependent on the person who just hit you? Or what if they have a green card that's dependent on you? What would it take for you to put them in a position to be deported? What if you come from a religious group where divorce is a sin or very much looked down, frowned on? What if you are LGBT and you look at your community as being impugned by you coming forward and talking about one other thing that could be frowned upon in your community? Or what if you're from a community where the police have not been your friends? What if you're first generation and you don't speak English? Think about all the external things that come in on people that keep them in that kind of a relationship.
Alice?
Yes?
One of the people that was not included in your list were people who are involved in law enforcement and how much power they have over the victims.
That tends to be true, Denise. Thanks for bringing that up. We do have, there has been talk that, and there's some research on it, that law enforcement is overrepresented, but then again, so were doctors. How many of you remember Jeffrey McDonald in Long Beach?
Yes.
Right? Who was accused of the ultimate domestic violence, which was killing his pregnant wife and 2 little girls. And I remember when he was out on hiatus, I went and spoke to the trauma team at St. Mary's. And he was a very charming guy. He was a guy that you would look at and people liked him and admired him. There are so many people who say, I will not be believed. When I was on the hotline at WomenShelter, we got calls fairly routinely from the same woman who was the wife of a minister in Long Beach. She was very well respected. And she said, nobody will believe me. I have nobody to talk to. And so she would make anonymous calls to the hotline just to have a place to talk. So there's all kinds of power that you look at and power dynamics that you look at in relationship. So let's go on further in this case. And by the way, a lot of people have a lot of hope for counseling, but they do something that doesn't work out very well for them, and that's to go into couples counseling. Couples counseling is not a real good idea when domestic violence is an issue because of the power dynamic, and because in couples counseling, there needs to be some sort of balance of power. There can't be a good guy, bad guy situation, because you can't continue to confront somebody who does a lot of nasty things to somebody in front of the people or the person that they hurt. There's the safety issue. So I suggest that the victim go into their own program and that the perpetrator go into their own program. And I will tell you that we do not have perpetrators of domestic violence come into Battered intervention programs because they think personal growth is far out and they can't wait to do it. You know, they come in either because their partner has left or threatened to leave, or God speaks to them through the SWAT team and they have a religious experience. So they're not coming in because they're just, you know, they can't wait to be there. But if the program has some meaning for them, they will stay. And by the way, California is one of, I believe, 3 states in the union that requires a minimum of 52 weeks in a battered intervention program. And that's not nearly enough when you're dealing with someone who has a lot of trauma in their own history and has a history of being violent. And for some of the folks we work with, they're not just violent in their intimate relationships, they're violent in the world, you know, or involved in crime in other places. So you're dealing with that. So what happens in this relationship is that they do get back together. Eventually, his violence gets so bad, and by the way, Denise, he is in law enforcement, and he moves his family away from their support system, and they move to a rural community. He has a job in a rural community. He gets very violent. The kids, one of the kids goes to school with a black eye. The teacher says, "What happened to you?" And the little boy starts to cry. So they call in the Department of Children and Family Services. At that time, the department did not separate family members. They're supposed to now. Most of the time that happens, but it doesn't always. So this worker came in and interviewed the whole family in front of the perpetrator. And of course, they all stuck to the same lie because they were afraid. When the social worker left, the father had a gun and he put it in everybody's face and he said, "If anybody comes out here again, I will kill you." So, needless to say, nobody did. What eventually happened is this mother hired a hit woman who shot and killed her husband. She was interviewed by Dan Rather years later, and he asked her, he said, "If you had this to do all over again, would you shoot your husband or have him shot?" And she said, "Yes, I would. I've never been as free as I am now." She's been in maximum security prison for over 20 years now. I can tell you that the women that I've worked with at California Institute for Women, the battered woman, one who had life without, was just released last month after 26 years. Most of those women are still in prison because the battered women's testimony was not viewed as relevant at that point. So when you're working with battered women, you have to work, first of all, with the trauma they experience, but even more, one of the things that keeps them where they are is the shame that they feel. Because generally speaking, when you stay in an abusive relationship, you have crossed your own bottom lines. And the more you cross your own bottom lines, the more shame you feel and the more anger you can feel at yourself. So forgiveness starts with being able to forgive yourself. And there's a difference between guilt and shame. I mean, guilt is about what I do, but shame is about who I am. And so I'm going to tell you another story about one of the battered women I worked with who was self-employed. She was very successful in her field. She came in, and it took her probably at least 10 months to be able to tell me something that she could not tell me before. And she was with somebody who was primarily emotionally abusive to her and abusive to pets, and also involved in other criminal behavior, which she was unaware of. So they got together, and she got married in her mid-30s, which at the time was a little older for her to get married. Not now, but at that time. And she was finally able to say to me, you know, Alyce, I had a cat that I loved. And this cat was like my baby. And I had him before I got in the relationship. After I got in the relationship, I came home one day and my partner was throwing my cat. And I got very upset. And I said, don't you ever touch my cat again. He said, I don't know what got into me, but da-da-da-da-da-da. She said, I never saw him do anything to the cat again. But I would come home some days and there was no water in the water dish, or there was no food in the food dish. And that was always replenished when I was there. One day I came home and the cat's paws were bleeding. And I said, what happened? And he said, oh my gosh, I dropped the glass. I thought I cleaned it all up. Maybe I didn't. And she said, and then finally I was there. I was in that relationship long enough that I came home one day and he picked up my cat and he took it out to the car. And I knew I would never see my cat again. And I didn't stop him. And she sobbed. And the shame that she felt, it takes, depending on what someone has, the bottom lines that they've crossed, it can take a long time for self-forgiveness to even occur. One of the things, I use film sometimes as a way to look at trauma. One of the films I use, and you've probably all seen it, but if you haven't seen it for a while, I'd say see it again, is Fried Green Tomatoes.
Yeah, I love that.
Isn't that a great film? But it's about empowerment for women, and it's about women owning stories. And it's a great one, and it allows people to laugh and cry vicariously for someone else. And that's really healing for trauma. It's really important. I want to talk about another longtime trauma sufferer that I worked with, because she was sort of amazing, and she was one of my very first clients, and I learned so much from her. And she was someone who was sexually abused as a child, verbally and emotionally abused, raped in high school. She was at a place where her anger and rage was so high and so out at the surface that she couldn't really, she couldn't hold jobs. She just had so much anger going, and she was afraid and fearful of her own anger. And for a lot of women, because anger is not an acceptable emotion, how to handle it becomes problematic. So I talked to her about, you know, things to do with anger, and I thought, I'm a therapist, so I should have a technique. And there's this one technique where Denise, I give you one end of a towel and I take the other end. And you resist me and say no, and I pull on the towel. And it's just a technique about setting limits and for anger. And I should have listened to her better because she didn't want to do anything aggressive. And for her, that was aggressive. And her eyes completely blanked out. And she looked like she was going to jump across the room and tear my eyes out. And imminent death is a great motivator for me. I dropped the towel right away. And I looked at her and I said, well, that's not one that's going to work for you, is it? And she said, no. And I knew she liked classical music. So I said, do you like classical music? And she said, yes. And I said, this is what I'd like you to do this week. I'd like you to pick 3 of the most powerful pieces of classical music that you can think of. Get the 1812 Overture, or the William Tell, or Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto, or Scheherazade. And I want you to lead the orchestra. Just throw your body into it and, you know, get into it. Big body movement is really good with trauma. And she said, well, I'd be kind of embarrassed. And I said, well, you live alone with your cat. Just try it and see if it works. And that's how we started. That's how I started with her. That's how I started with her on feeling more comfortable with moving her body with her trauma, which is really helpful. Now later, she would tell me, I learned so much from her because she had a great sense of humor. But about 2 months after, you know, telling me about her trauma, she then said, by the way, have I told you that I vomit every day? And I said, no, you didn't tell me that, but it's good you didn't because, you know, I'm a therapist. There's only so much I can take. And she had a great sense of humor, so I could play with her in that way. But I decided I would try to do a guided imagery with her. Now, that's not a technique I've used much either. And I wound up getting her, she came in very depressed. And I wound up getting her driving to Idlewild during rush hour on a Friday afternoon forgetting to feed her cat. I don't know how I did that because it's not a good way to use that technique, but I look at her and she's shaking, and I thought I knew she had seizures. I thought I'd thrown her into a seizure, and I didn't. She was actually laughing, and she looked at me and said, you don't do this very well, do you? And I said, no, as a matter of fact, I suck. But it worked, didn't it? You came in depressed, and now you're laughing. So there are all kinds of different things you can do in terms of working with trauma. But one of the things I like to do is to give people assignments. Battered women oftentimes feel like they don't solve problems very well. And it's because they're trying to solve the wrong problem. They're trying to change the person who hits them or hurts them psychologically, however that's going down, whether they're gaslighting them, whether they're psychologically abusing them, whether they're physically abusing them, sexually, all of the above. So they're trying to change that person, and they continue to fail because that person is not cooperating. That person is not going to change. It's like trying to change an alcoholic. They're not going to change because of something you do. That has to be, unless perhaps you leave and they wind up going and getting help. But beyond that, they don't tend to change without getting their own help. So I try to focus battered women on things that they can do. I want them to start to experience success. So I work on assignments with them, and assignments that they will agree to, not things that I want, but things that they will agree to. Does anybody, by the way, have any questions or input to this point? Because I'm just rambling on. So anybody have anything they want to say at this point? You're muted, Linda. You're muted.
I'm sorry. I'd like to know if you're still working.
Oh, yeah. I don't think I'll ever retire. I love what I do.
Because I think I have somebody to refer to you.
Oh.
So, okay.
Yeah, you know, I was the expert witness on the Jodi Arias death penalty murder case.
Oh,
And I continue to get stuff on that. And I just got a contact from Michigan just this week from a woman who wants me to see her in therapy because she doesn't. And what I'm trying to do, because I think people are better off seeing somebody in person and making that connection. I try to hook them up locally with the Battered Women Shelter because Battered Women Shelters do support groups and personal empowerment groups. And personal empowerment groups are structured and about self-esteem. I think they're really good ways to go. And then there's the more general kind of group that they do. So I don't do Battered Women support groups, but you get different things from group and individual. So yeah, I've got 5 battered women that I'm seeing in my private practice right now, as well as other folks that I'm seeing, and it's all on Zoom, but it's, you know, it's fine. And I'm doing my men's groups on Zoom as well. So I still do both perpetrator groups and I still see victims, and then my broad-based private practice. And I'm actually doing court cases on Zoom too, which is kind of interesting. Anybody else have something they want to bring up before I
Yeah,
go
no,
on?
Alyce, if I can say something.
Yeah, Jenny?
I just want to praise you. I'm looking down at the participants and you haven't lost one person.
Oh,
What you're saying is so important and so interesting. And, you know, thank God I've never been battered, but I think this is an issue that we all need to be aware of. And I appreciate you sharing your expertise with us.
oh, thanks. You know, one of the things I would say, Jenny, is for a lot of women, and I was listening to Frances and Carolyn talking about that, and Linda said she'd leave. With Frances and Carolyn, when they were talking about emotional abuse, what's really hard with emotional abuse is a lot of people suffer that. And they don't define it as abuse because in film, they see people dragged out of the house, you know, on a gurney or black eyes and all this kind of thing. Emotional abuse is very difficult because it's like grabbing at air. It's hard to tell people what's happening. And I have people talk about being gaslit, like, for instance, one of the clients that I've had, her partner, they've separated, but her partner, they have a smart house. The partner comes over in the middle of the night and turns on the stereo or the music as loud as it can go and disrupts, you know, everybody in the house. They wake up terrified. People park across the street so you can see that the car's across the street. I just had that happen with one of my clients. And now she's wondering, is he going to come in the house? Is he going to break in? Instagram, there's a lot of social media kind of stuff that's going on. I can tell you just for myself, I'm still being, after 7 years of this case, my TED Talk that I did has been stalked by the people that hated that I testified for Jodi Arias, and they've made lousy comments about me all over it. And that still continues to go on. And I think with battered women, they've got, there are people that are going after their careers, they're going to their job sites and harassing their bosses, harassing, in other words, generalizing the fear to other people. So there is so much that goes on, name calling and put downs. When you put somebody down and they are not telling their friends and family what's going on, because you're not, you begin to self-isolate pretty early on in a domestically abusive relationship. And the more extreme the isolation, generally the more dangerous the situation is. And so if you've got somebody who's intentionally isolating you, making, you know, interrogating you after you go out with your friends, embarrassing you in front of your friends, putting your friends down and saying that your friends are saying things about you, giving you the silent treatment when you go out. when they intentionally isolate you, that is more severe. But self-isolation happens because you start monitoring what you are willing to say to other people about what's going on in your life. And so that is hard because your friends, I can't tell you how many women I've worked with who their friends had no knowledge. And when they finally leave and they're in a child custody situation and there's a fight, they don't have any evidence. You have to try to create evidence by, for instance, asking old friends, have they changed? Are they different people than they used to be? Describe your friend before, describe your friend now. Did you ever see anything? Did you ever hear anything from the kids? Who showed up for soccer matches? Who showed up for school? You know, you just have to create a whole, context to be able to defend anybody in a family law case. It's really tough. And I can tell you, I've worked with a number of women who, right now in the state of California, shared custody is the law of the land. You have to really demonstrate egregious abuse to get somebody out of a shared custody situation. So I talk to women who won't leave because they say 50% of the time, my kids are going to be with this person and I'm going to have no way to protect my children. So once again, do people have questions? Because
Alyce, in the chat box, there's one from Terry Armstrong, and she asked, what is the success rate of the perpetrator program? Is there a high recidivism rate for perpetrators?
Carrie, it's hard to know. Here's some of the things I look at. Like, I got a pumpkin bread from one of the wives of the men in my group who said thank you. And that was something that measured success for me. When I have somebody come back for a tune-up, when people, for instance, in my West LA group now, almost everybody but 3 men in the group have been in for over 3 years. I consider that success. I consider it success when I hear a family that can now have dinner together and the kids aren't afraid to say something to their dad. So I hear nuances about, so everything is different. When you're dealing with somebody, for instance, I've dealt with people, I dealt with a guy who had murdered, I've dealt with more than a couple people who've murdered people. When you have dealt with people who are murdering people, I feel like it's pretty successful when they're not murdering their partners. I have low standards for success in my program. So, so you look at things like that. You look at the movement of where somebody starts and where they're moving toward. The development of empathy is something we really work on because if you can empathize, and we have gay and straight in our group, and generally speaking, we have cross-cultural. So for instance, during the O.J. Simpson trial, we were able to talk about racism. We were able to talk about racism at different times during group, because when you can understand one form of oppression, it's easier to understand another. For instance, men in group don't often understand that women's fear is different than theirs, and how women are frightened and why they're frightened is different than how the men in group are frightened. So being able to explain fear to them gives them an understanding. When you hear somebody say, I never thought my wife could be afraid of me just because I yelled, or just because I said I would kill myself, or just because I said I would kill her. I didn't think she'd believe me. It's really, I continue to do the work because I love it. And because I have enough, I get to do this kind of thing. I get to do public speaking. I get to do expert witness. I have enough variety, and I only do 2 men's groups for a week, or 2 men's groups. If I was doing more men's groups, I think I could burn out, but I don't. And I mix up my private practice so I don't burn out. So I'm not just hearing about violence, So I love what I do. I can't imagine retiring it. And I keep thinking, even if I get demented, that I will say something that makes no sense, but people will look at it and go, boy, that's heavy. I bet she meant something by that. I'm going to think about that. You know, so.
All right.
Alice,
Yeah.
this is Faye.
Mhm.
I was just wondering, have you ever worked with a man who was being berated by his wife?
Yes, yes, I have, Faye. I've worked with a couple of men who I considered, in fact, one of my first female perpetrators was when I still worked at WomenShelter, and I had just started my perpetrator program in 1979, and I think she came in 80 or 81, and she had, you know, she called him all kinds of names. She held knives on him. She set his clothes on fire. And fortunately, he was not in them at the time, but she did that. And she came on her own accord because she felt so terrible about what she was doing. He was one of the only men that I've seen that psychologically looked like battered women. You know, the whole deal. Because a lot of the men will come in and they don't like what the women, you know, are doing, but they are not afraid of them. And fear adds a different dimension. So when the men become afraid, it changes the dynamic. Does that make sense? Yeah, so you get women become fearful. In fact, there's some research that talks about when men get hit by women, that they tend to get angry or laugh it off. When women get hit by men, they tend to get humiliated and fearful.
Okay.
Alice, we don't have much time left. I have just one question. Are there any big changes that you see in the future with laws that might support victims a little bit better and help the kids out?
I'll tell you what's happened, and this is discouraging for me. When we started in the late 70s, the laws that came out were more flexible, and we actually got farther. What happened is, as people started getting creating more rigid laws, we're actually backwards as far as I'm concerned. And we used to have laws that made it easier to get a restraining order, that made it easier for people to get into perpetrators groups, that was possible to get expunged, that it was, you know, what's happening now because of mandatory arrest, that's kind of morphed into pro-arrest, but mandatory arrest is more people are fighting charges and not going into counseling, which they used to. There are more dual restraining orders being issued because if a woman or a victim, male or female, fights back and leaves a mark, they get arrested too. So you've got dual restraining orders, and you've got what's called in family law the rebuttable presumption, which means if you're accused of being a perpetrator, that you have to rebut the presumption that you are by doing a 52-week program. So now women are being accused of being perpetrators as well, even if they're not. So we've gotten more rigid. I think we need to make laws that make sense, and we need to talk to the people who are most affected by the laws. When I started my perpetrator program, I went and talked to the battered women at our shelter. I said, what do I need to know about your partners, and what do you think needs to be included in a program? Because oftentimes we create laws and policies without ever talking to the people who are most affected by them. And I see this trickle down. I see it in education. Instead of talking to the teachers, the administration makes the policy. I see this happening in all kinds of places. And I think we need to be more collaborative in how we work with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Alice, I'm looking at the time, and this has been an incredible session. I'm looking at the chat, and it seems that there are certainly more people than we ever know who may have been affected by these issues. And, you know, it's very courageous that people have shared. I want to thank you for creating the safe space for that. And, you know, Denise's question was a great one. And here's what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, to wrap up, is if you've already said that something we need to do is to look at the laws and advocate for things, changes that are going to be more beneficial to survivors. And as we all know, AAUW California and national and strategic priorities include a deep commitment to women's safety, women's and our families' safety. And so through political action, through watching propositions, through advocacy, we can have an impact on that. So if I could ask you to just wrap up and maybe give us your top 3 action steps, like you would recommend to our group, what could we as a group do as an action step, or what may individuals wish to pursue? I did place in the chat box much earlier hotline numbers, national hotline numbers, WomenShelter, LGBTQ Center of Long Beach. But would you, to close it out, give us your top 3, give us some options for taking action.
Okay, number 1, there has been a push to try to do away with 52-week programs and have probation assess for dangerousness, which is not a good idea. So that law, I would say AAUW needs to push to keep a minimum of 52 weeks. I would also say that we need to start looking at diversion programs with probation officers that monitor them. Part of what's happening now is we used to have probation officers that monitored the participants in our programs. Now we don't. And the third thing is we need domestic violence dedicated courtrooms. We used to have Judge Andrews was our, things were so different when she was, for 9 years, Long Beach had the best system anywhere in the state of California. I thought one of the best in the country because we had wraparound with everything. We had we had the program, the DV unit in the police department, the DV unit in the city prosecutor's office. I hate to say anything, but Tom Reed dismantled it and that it ended. And so we need those programs. The other thing I want to tell you, if you're interested, Alyce is with a Y, but I have a website, AlyceLaViolette.com. There are handouts on it. There's one that's called Tips for Victims that I did as a brochure for the foresters. That's good if you have people that are victims that want to see it. My phone number, my contact information is there. If anybody wants to contact me, call me. I call people back or I answer my cell phone. So thank you so much. You guys were so great. I so appreciate it. And of course, Jean, who I've known forever and value so much, and all of you, I'm so glad to be a member. Thank you for including me.
Thank you very much, Alyce. This ends our program for today. What a great program. Great program, thought-provoking and personal benefits as well. So thanks to everyone.